This is our first session for Tovshin Pei Aleph, and we were in the middle of a very important and interesting inyan about halacha changing. And there's certainly more to say about that, but I just felt when it came to Parshas Bereishis, there was something that sort of jumped out at me, which we've spoken about aspects of before, which I wanted to come to. So I put the other inyan on hold for now. And as you see from the title, I want to speak, I just call it Ethics from Bereishis, which is a little bit vague, for want of a better title. But since it's Parshas Bereishis this week, I think it definitely behooves us to think about Brias Ha'olam. We think about where we came from, where everything came from, the beginning of everything. And the beginning of the world is the beginning of humanity, and the beginning of civilization, the beginning not only of living a life, but of living a meaningful life. One of the most fundamental things that mankind was given, one of the most fundamental rules, was the rule of gezel, not to steal. And that, of course, we know is the underpinning of civilization. And very soon into the story of Sefer Bereishis, we learn that when it's kept, then civilization survives, and when it's not, then civilization falls apart, as happened in the Dar HaMabul. It's a very, very fundamental thing, and it's in some ways maybe the basis of everything, since civilization, and to a certain extent meaningful life, sort of crumbles away. If there's no respect for things of others, there's hardly any sense of morality. It's also, and perhaps we'll come back to that, one could also say that if one has no sense of this belongs to me and something else belongs to someone else, and I respect that, then in time, equally one won't respect the fact that this is that this belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore I use the world as he has asked me to use the world. So on many levels, it's a very, very fundamental thing. Going back to the root, to the dawn of creation, Hashem created Adam HaRishon. He put him in the world, and he said to him, I'm putting you in the garden, I want you to do specific things with the garden. And Chazal say a wording, he said to him, Pen lev sheloi sachriv oilami. I believe that's the wording of the Medrash. He said, be careful not to spoil my world. Adam HaRishon was told you're given a beautiful world, a valuable world, a world with tremendous resources. Be careful not to spoil it. Now, where is the makor? Where is the source of the idea that one mustn't steal? Where does that moral imperative or halachic imperative or religious imperative, where does it come from? So Chazal say, yeah. Simon, did you unmute yourself to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that I always understood that Gezel was one of those things that was sort of poshut. It was logical that you didn't need a makor.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of truth in that, because if you look at the beginning of a standard Gemara, just before Brachos based on the Aleph, there is a page with quite a lot of fine print. And don't worry, it's not the terms and conditions. It's the Hakdama of Reb Nissim Gaon, one of the Gaonim. And in that, he alludes to this idea. He says there's a concept of something which is a mitzvah sichlis, something you know you ought to do, or something about an imperative you know you ought to adhere to, without having been told it. Without having been told, it's completely intuitive. That's an important idea, and he does say that, and I want to come back to that presently. But it also has a makor as being one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach. because the Gemara says in Sanhedrin around Daf Nun Tes, it says that the mitzvahs, the so-called mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and it's interesting that they're called mitzvahs b'nei Noach, because in fact only one of them was given to Noach, the other 6 had been previously given to Adam HaRishon. That's no secret. The Rambam writes when he describes them in Sefer Melachim, he says, Sheish mitzvahs nitztava Adam HaRishon. Maybe they're called b'nei Noach because civilization had to be reset and restarted when Noach came along and he passed these things on to the new civilization, I guess. That's why they're called that, probably. But the 6 mitzvahs were given to Adam, and the Gemara goes through where is the source of each of them. Where do we see a hint in the Psukim at how each one was given to him? And concerning the mitzvah of Gezel, which, as you know, is one of the 6, along with various other fundamental things, Avodah Zarah, murder, set up courts of law, and so on, and not to be adulterous. The Gemara says we derive it from the words that Adam said, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Adam HaRishon. He said, you may eat from any of the trees of the garden, however, the one tree, the Eitz Hadas Tov, that you mustn't eat from. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling him, this I allow you to eat, this I don't allow you to eat. So implicit in that is, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to me, I tell you not to eat, and therefore there's such a thing as not to steal. That, I believe, is where the Gemara learns it from. The following, I think, is not really Torah, but it's something that that is discussed from time to time in discussions of religious dogma, religious creed, fundamentals of religion. It is sometimes argued that when one gets back to basics and one may debate the whole Metzias Hashem, the whole existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with someone who is discussing that or is challenging the idea, one of the ideas that's said is that if you believe there's absolute morality, you must believe in God, because how could there be an absolute morality? What's to stop everyone deciding his own truth if there's no God? And one of the really good English books about the fundamental basis for Emunah, Rabbi Kellerman's book, Permission to Believe, which I think is an excellent book, he makes this point, and on this particular point, I happen to think he's not wholly correct. Because he makes this argument, there's this first of 4 or 5 chapters about evidence that would give a modern person permission to be rational yet believe in God. That's I don't know if you know the book, it's a book well worth reading, but that's the angle he approaches it from, speaking the language some contemporary people. But he makes this argument. He said there couldn't be a concept of an absolute morality if not for God, because why can't everyone's morality be his own? And I think, and I actually heard in the name of Rabbi David Gottlieb, he said this is not correct philosophically, and I think it can't be correct, because if you believe there's no, let's start this way. Why do I say it's not correct? Because a person could be an atheist. I'm not arguing for that position, but a person could be an atheist and nevertheless believe that there's some deep intuition that there's just a morality. It's simply wrong to steal or wrong to murder. I don't think he needs to justify it in any other terms. It's a moral intuition, and it's a philosophically valid idea, I think. I mean, just to hear your thoughts. But before you say that, I would add that I think it goes further. If you don't accept the idea that it could be an intrinsically moral thing, you could get into a really difficult conundrum. Because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu did create the world, and did say, well, here's my world, and this is how I'd like you to use it, what is the moral basis for our duty to fulfill that. If the moral, if you say, well, the world belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, therefore I must keep to his instructions regarding his world, that means I have, so to speak, pre-existing, in a philosophical sense, a pre-existing sense, that's what makes right and wrong. But if I deny that to start with, then what makes it a moral duty upon me to listen to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even if I concede that he is the creator of everything? I mean, it might be that it might be unwise not to listen to him, because might makes right, but it wouldn't make it morally right or wrong. One has to have that moral sense of right and wrong at the very foundation of everything in terms of one's thinking. It can't come afterwards. What I would say, however, is that I think the correct position is a bit of a compromise, a bit of an in-between between the two positions. So Rabbi Kellerman, if you like, is saying, well, there can be no morality unless it comes from an absolute source. Rabbi Gottlieb is saying there can be, and philosophically there can be, and there has to be, otherwise you wouldn't have any morality even after the absolute source. And I'm saying, I think philosophically what Rabbi Gottlieb is saying is correct, but one could nevertheless say that one cannot imagine a sense of moral duty and moral responsibility emerging in a godless world, just like in the animal kingdom. Animals have probably no sense of moral right or wrong. They just eat what they need to eat and so on. Why should a haphazard biological organism have any sense of right or wrong? So whilst philosophically the idea could be valid, practically it could be, one could think it doesn't make sense. Those are my musings about the deepest beginnings of morality, our sense of right and wrong, and our sense of in particular homing on, not taking that which doesn't belong to me. Any observations on that? Okay with that? Okay.
I was going to say, I think that it makes sense to say that there are certain moral principles that that can be derived logically, and then there are others that cannot, and therefore the what you were saying about the position somewhere between the two, that there can be moral underpinnings that can almost exist without the necessity of Hashem's involvement, and there are others that can only exist because we've been taught them.
I think if I understand you correctly, I think you're speaking about a different aspect of this, and that is the details. You're saying the most basic core moral ideas could be directly intuitive. You can't take something which obviously doesn't belong to you. But when it comes to pinning down finer details of that, there's so much room to say this way or that way, consider something grave. So who's going to be the arbiter? Is that what you're saying?
That's part of it, but you can also argue, for example, and the one that comes to mind is certain. You could say it. The easiest one that comes to mind is forbidden relationships, because it's hard to see how, say, intuitively, or the basis of you can say with stealing, with murder, you can come up with a logical basis for why these are absolute moral values. But with forbidden relationships, one can understand that as a basic moral principle, and it is a basic moral principle that we have. But I'm not sure that it always would be easy to come up with from a logical underpinning.
Well, when you say logical underpinning, you're implying a foundation, as it were, below it. So you sounds like you're saying that the various moral fundamentals that you mention can be derived logically from something more fundamental, which itself is self-evident, but the moral concept itself is not self-evident. So why would you be
Yes,
saying
I'm
that?
almost saying I am almost saying that. I agree with you. I think I am saying that not stealing is in and of itself not the most fundamental logical underpinning, but maybe
What's
you
more
could say
fundamental than that?
respect, the respect for so not stealing is respecting somebody else's property. So it's a recognition that an individual can have possessions and that they have the right to use those possessions unimpeded. And therefore stealing is violating that right, and that is there's something more fundamental. I mean, murder is the same thing with the person, that a person has the right to exist.
You've got to fundamentally recognize the person's identity, almost, the person, as it were, possessing his possessions or possessing his life.
Yes.
Before you start going to the next stage, and from that flows the idea that someone else may not tamper with it.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. But the ideas are very closely related.
But I was saying to you, you can then, I'm not sure how easy it is to extend that to all moral principles that we hold, absolute moral principles that we hold, that we know to be true from Torah. That's what I'm questioning. I'm not necessarily giving an answer. I'm questioning it. That I can see some that and then it almost goes back to plenty of times we think the chukim, that there are certain laws in the Torah that a society would potentially arrive at without having to be taught them, because they're just logical. That's how a society clearly works better when you have such laws in place.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas others, we know you can't derive it from just thought hypothesis. It's only because we've been taught them that we know that to be true.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be correct. When you get to the next stage of the most, or perhaps the most fundamental thing, is a sense of people or beings having possessions, and therefore being morally inappropriate for someone else to violate that. Once one has that concept about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then every instruction that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us in terms of our usage of the world becomes itself an extension of that idea, and therefore becomes intuitive in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay, it's interesting that moving on from that we find a few things near the beginning of Bereishis, of Sefer Bereishis, which amplify that theme. Once we have the basic idea of as you're describing it, Simon, respect for the belongings of HaKadosh Baruch Hu or of others, and that being a basic part of being human, being a person of some moral quality. I see a lot of aspects of that in Chumash. For example, it says in not at the beginning of Bereishis, but at the beginning of Vayikra, it says Adam ki yakriv mikem korban Hashem. If a man amongst you offers up the korban, it tells you halachas of the korban, starting with korban adava. But it's interesting, he uses the word Adam. And Rashi brings on that from Chazal, the Medrash, that it says, why does it start with the word Adam? To hint to you that just like Adam, everything he offered up was his, because there was no one else in the world, and everything was given to him. So any animal that he chose to bring as a korban, or that he would have chosen to bring as a korban, was absolutely his. So too, every korban that you may bring should be absolutely yours. And that's a source for the idea of mitzvah baba avera, of the fact that a stolen animal is not valid as a korban. And it occurred to me, possibly I saw this, I heard this from others as well, that by comparing it to Adam, it's teaching a very profound lesson. Because, I mean, there might have been other ways to hint that we shouldn't use something stolen. And the lesson may be that ever since Adam Rishon, we own our possessions. We have a fairly good idea of what's ours and what's not ours. But we never know as we go through life when we have taken something that was a little bit, in circumstances which were a little bit grey. Perhaps we shouldn't have taken that money. Perhaps we should not have accepted that. Once you have a massive humanity and things flowing from one to the other, like the Gemara says, one of the words for money is zuz, because the nature of money is to move. Now, zuz means to move. That's how it is. It flows around, and you can only be so sure that everything that you have is absolutely yours. And the only exception to that is Adam. So what we're taught is that the pristine way of bringing a korban, the absolute ideal way of bringing a korban, is to have the same sense of being truly clean from anything that I shouldn't have as Adam was. At the same time, it's a reminder to us that it's quite a high level to live by. It's not so easy to be sure that one is truly doing that. It's something that one needs to work on. It's a similar idea, actually, when we're talking about Adam's being alone in the world and the implications that it had. There's a not dissimilar, though in the context of a different theme, a not dissimilar idea is said as follows. In the Shema Brachos, we say, Samach Tesamach Re'em Ahuvim, Kesamecha Chayitzircha Began Eden Mikedem. So we say about this Chosn Kala we have in front of us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, may you make happy these beloved friends, these loving friends, the Chosn and Kala, as you made happy your creations, Adam and Chava, in Gan Eden and in former times, at the very beginning. And the idea that said, I don't know if this has an early source, but it's very often quoted, is that the comparison with Adam and Chava in Gan Eden is that they both had a sense that she is absolutely for me. There's no one else. There could not have been anyone else. This is absolutely right. That's a sort of pristine situation that you had in Gan Eden. And ever since then, we've not been quite there, but we always aim to get back to that. The three highlight personalities, as we know of Sefer Bereishis, of these early generations, Adam, and then Noach, and then Avram Avinu. And in all three of them, we find this echoes of this theme, ideas relating to care with the property of others, Gezel, and so on. In the case of both Noach and Avram Avinu, you find the concept that together is something which destroys society. I mean, that's what we saw really in Noach. But the exact opposite of that is if one goes to the other extreme and one absolutely does not want to take from others, then on the contrary, one wants to give. And that might be why the world was destroyed on account for various things, but in a major way, as we know from Rashi and Chazal on the story of the Mabul, the final psak din was because of Gezel. That's what brought the Mabul in the end. And Noach was made to run a teva, to have all the animals of the world in a teva for months, in which he had to spend pretty much the entire time, his waking hours and beyond his waking hours, giving to the animals. And I think it's a medrash which quotes the pasuk Olam Chesed Yibana. The world was rebuilt with chesed. Noach had to give and give and give, rather than just be taking from others, or have a sense of taking, rather be a giver, and that's what rebuilt the world. And that was the fundamental thing the world was created for. And that was a major thing that Avraham Avinu stood for. And it's also probably no coincidence that Avraham Avinu is famous for the two things, for chesed, for giving to others, and for being a trailblazer in emunah. Emunah was his ability to see the truth, to be able to see the truth, to recognize Hashem properly, demands being intellectually honest, demands not having one's own agenda. And someone who's selfless is much more interested in giving to others than in taking for himself. If someone is not going to have his own agenda, and he's able and wants to see things and see HaKadosh Baruch Hu and see Emunah for what it is. And that's probably why there's a connection between Avraham Avinu's care in this area, his chesed, his kindness to others, and his Emunah. Avraham Avinu then stood in stark contrast. And now we're talking in this country about national lockdowns and regional lockdowns. Well, in the Torah and Parshas Noach, there was a global lockdown with the Mabul. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, that's enough. We had a national lockdown March, April. That was quite enough to destroy the world. Well, don't want to do that again. But when the Sodom situation came along, it didn't destroy the world again, but it did destroy Sodom. And in Sodom, you had your own flavor of atrocity, had all sorts of slightly different things happening. But there was a certain overlap between the Lenechtam Dinam ala Gezel, El ala Gezel of the Mabul and of Sodom, because what Sodom was famous for, as mentioned in the Mishnah in the 5th parak of Pirkei Avos, in the 5th parak of Pirkei Avos, it mentions there are 4 types of people when it comes to the attitude to one's own property and the property of others. You probably remember this Mishnah. And one of them is the ideal attitude is for the person to say Shali, Shalach, the Shalach. What's mine can be yours, and what's yours is yours. What's yours I'm not going to take, but at the same time, what's mine I'm willing to share with you. But on the other side of the spectrum, or one of the attitudes on the other side of the spectrum is Shali, Shali, Shalach. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. So the Mishnah says, first opinion, that's an attitude which is Beinoni. That's an average person. He's not do no evil, but yet he keeps his own for himself. He doesn't want to do evil to others. Seems quite average. But the Mishnah says that Yesh Oimrim Zu Midah Sodom. Some people see that as the midah of Sodom, because to think in an absolute sense. Good evening, Joe. We're just talking about a general theme in Sefer Bereishis of respect for the property of others, Gezel, not stealing. We've honed in on the fact that in Sodom they had the attitude of what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, and not just in the sense that I don't have that push to be good to others, but in a very ideological sense, and that's what made it so evil. What's mine, I insist what's mine is mine, and how dare you ever suggest that I should give away anything of mine to someone else. That's an idea which makes them lose the whole right to live, basically, because the world was created to people who could rise beyond that. That's what you might expect in the animal kingdom, but not amongst human beings. There's a famous question asked in Parshas Vayera. Now we know that 3 malachim came to visit Avraham Avinu, right? One was to cure Avraham Avinu from the bris milah. One was to deliver the good news that Sarah was going to have a child. And the third, he was going to destroy Sodom. So he was on his way to Sodom. So the question is asked, why did he need to go to Avraham Avinu? I'm not sure if this is the real answer, but there's a famous idea which is said in the name of Dayan Abramsky. Possibly it's hinted at in the Sforno as well, maybe it's said by the Sforno. And that is that as what is sometimes said over in the manner of an anecdote, the Malachim were sent to destroy Sodom, but they said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, look, how can you do this? How can you destroy a world? What do you expect from human beings? You created human beings with a certain level of selfish desire. So this is what happens. So you've got to accept it, as it were. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to them, I want you to visit the house of Avraham Avinu, and you'll see what a human being can make of himself. And then you'll understand why the people of Sodom have failed so badly and have no choice but to destroy them. And that's why the Malach who was destroying Sodom had to go to Avraham Avinu first. It's a very nice and powerful idea. One of the names of Sefer Bereishis is Sefer HaYashar, because the Netziv writes about this in his introduction to Sefer Bereishis, because it's a book in which is described personalities of people who strove to a higher level of humanity and who were truly straight, truly honest and truth-seeking, and so on. So I think there's some inspiration we can take from Sefer Bereishis as we look back to the beginning of everything, and the beginning of where we and our values and what we stand for, what we want to perpetuate in our lives, came from. Now that's by way of introduction, but we like discussing halachas in this session. So the idea I want to develop from there is there are certain issues which I've noticed over the years, and they're disparate, different ideas, different issues where people slip up. In other words, in our own lives and the level we seek to live, I hope it's not a challenge for us not to shoplift or pickpocket or commit major fraud in any open manner. So if we need to address our foibles, our weaknesses, our challenges, and we need to consider where is it that we can work, what might be our weaknesses in the area of low sigzag, in the area of respecting the property of others, in the area of not stealing. And I've noticed over the years 4 things where people tend not to be so worried, but maybe ought to be more aware. There may be more than 4, but 4 main ones. That's what I wanted to see if we could get through. Number 1, people think that trespassing is not gezer. In other words, they understand if I walk into someone's house and I take a movable item of his, I've taken it away and I've stolen it. But if I merely walk into his house or come into someone's land, that's not stealing. And I was looking over the years to see whether is a halachic basis for that. Can one prove one way or the other? What prohibition, if any, does one transgress from walking unauthorized in another person's property? Because on the one hand, I saw that point. You're not really taking anything. It's rather intangible and ephemeral. On the other hand, it doesn't really make sense that we should say, well, we can't forbid it, and therefore, technically, it's actually a mutah. Also seems strange. But the truth is, there are sources. I think it's a mistake, because part of the issa of stealing is not simply taking away someone's article, it's making use of someone's article in an unauthorized fashion. And if one uses someone's land, that is what one is doing. So if you'd be operating a taxi service, and you do not allow anyone to jump into your taxi, you run a train, you're a train operator. You do not allow people to go on your trains unless they've paid first. And someone sneaks on and just stands on the train as it travels from London to Manchester. You may say, well, I haven't done anything. I've just stood here. And when the train arrives at its destination, I just walked off. But in truth, he has done something. He's used the surface of the train. Okay, that moves. It's not quite land. It's the same idea. I haven't taken it anywhere. How can I prove that point? I think there are various proofs for that point. There's a posuk in Chumash, "L'sasig gvul re'acha," the famous phrase "masig gvul." Masig gvul is often used for one who's encroaching on someone else's parnasa. But interestingly, in its original usage, it doesn't mean that. In its original usage, it means you have a field and your neighbor has a field, and you quite fancy your land being a bit larger than his, or being a bit larger than yours currently is. So you move the land marker along a little bit into his, in the hope that he won't notice. And that's it in the Torah of lo sasig gvul re'acha. There might be a slight distinction whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz, but it's clear that there is an issa doing it everywhere. And it's mentioned there are rayas that it's a branch of stealing. So why is it stealing? You haven't taken anything away. And the answer, I think, is you had no right to come into his land and move, even the very moving of the marker across. You have no right to use his land for that. And therefore, there is an issa of loy sigzail in making unauthorized use of someone's land or someone's surfaces, whatever they may be. And this is a sukkah-related issue as well, because there's the whole sukkah in the Gemara around sukkah daf lamed aleph, sukkah gezula, and various discussions about how a case of sukkah gezula, stolen sukkah, would arise. But it's clear there are cases of stolen sukkahs. Again, this is probably a source of that idea. So that's misconception number one. Trespassing and similar actions, even though there may be a principle karka ein nigzeles, the land can't be stolen, that would just mean, you see, when one steals something, there are two things. There's the prohibition of stealing it, and there's the various halachas that result from having stolen it. So, for example, if one steals, the famous halacha of Yush and Shinoi Rishus, the reality is, when one steals something, obviously, when a ganav steals something, he shouldn't have stolen it. It should never have happened, and restitution should be made. And if mankind doesn't make restitution, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will. That's clear. At the same time, halacha recognizes a reality. Just like halacha recognizes if you lose something, you're in a ship, and something dropped onto the ocean, someone else finds it. There are circumstances that, halacha recognizes finders keepers. Person lost something, there was yush. the ownership is terminated. You can't, your ownership, as it were, dissolves if in whatever circumstances, according to what halacha dictates. In a similar way, if you steal something and then the person abandons hope, he has what we call Yush, which I'm sure you've all heard of, the famous sugyas of how Yush works, mainly in the second parak of Mitzvah. If Yush has occurred after Ganav steals something, and then that stolen article is passed on to a third party, that third party is then allowed to keep that article, because the original owner no longer has a right to it. In the same way, they don't have right to his lost articles. As I say, that doesn't mean that the Ganav wouldn't have to pay for having stolen it. He now would have to pay money rather than returning the original article. So it doesn't get him off the hook for having stolen, but it could be he doesn't have to give that article back. So there are various halachas. There's the act of stealing, gazela, and there are halachas that are attendant upon having stolen something, because you've misappropriated it, because you've taken it away. So when the Gemara says karka in an exeles, land can't be stolen, that should not, when you come across that in the Gemara, should not understand that as meaning that you don't do a prohibition of gezer by taking karka. What it means is, it doesn't have the halach of having been taken away and stolen, such that various other halachas would come into play. That's the issue of karka and exeles and question or misconception number one. Issue number two is, are there any circumstances in which one is allowed to take someone's article because it's so it's worth so little, you just really wouldn't mind? No one is bothered about this sort of thing. So the halacha actually is that one may. There is a it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, or maybe only in one of the Mepharshim of Shulchan Aruch. It's brought from the Yerushalmi. Suppose someone has a fence. I don't know if any of you have a fence outside your house. But if you have a fence, would you mind if a passerby takes a tiny splinter from your fence as he's passing because he needs to use it as a toothpick? Or even if he doesn't. Tiny splinter. Would that bother you? I don't think it would. And if it would, then pick something even smaller. At a certain point at which it's a blade of grass from your garden. At a certain point at which it's so trivial that you wouldn't mind. And therefore, the halacha says there's no together. It's something that people aren't bothered about at all. You're not really in any way violating a person's rights of ownership. However, the Yerushalmi says there's a midas chasidus not to do that. It's better not to do that. Why? Because you don't mind that one person takes one blade of grass, but what you would mind is a 1,000 people seeking to take advantage and be abusive to you would come along and each take one blade of grass, or each bring 1,000 of their friends and take one blade of grass until there's none left. So the Yerushalmi said, because this is something that in far-fetched circumstances could result in real harm happening to someone, there's a midas chasidus not to do the small thing in the first place. Now, that's not to say if it's 1,000 people coming together, more than a midas chasidus not to do it, because collective. This is what the Der Hamabel did. They abused the law by deliberately plotting that each person would come along to a person who was selling peas and each take one pea. So there was no action could be taken against them. And yet collectively they done something very destructive to that person, particularly if they did it repeatedly. That certainly is a very wicked thing to do. But what the Yerushalmi is talking about is doing it where I have no expectation that others are going to come along and copy me. And I may do it, but there would be a midas chassidus not to do it. There's a famous story of the Chofetz Chaim when he was a child, and his friends at one time wanted to play a prank on a poor person who used to sell apples from a stall on the street corner. And I believe the story was the story was something slightly different. They all took one, or they knocked it over, and all the apples fell out. But the Chofetz Chaim, being who he was, even though he was a young boy at the time, felt very guilty about having caused any loss to the vendor. But at the same time, he was embarrassed to go to him and admit it. But he ran past at some point, threw in some apples, and ran away again. See, that's a story that we have to be conscious of that. So that is situation number 2. Is there a heter to take something so small that a person doesn't mind? We do have a concept in halacha of something worth less than a pruta. I don't know the exact value of a pruta. Various attempts have been made. People do find out the value of a pruta if they need to. There aren't so many halachas that it's relevant for. One of the most well-known Gemaras, which talks about the issue of a pruta, the Gemara in Kedushim, which says you can be mekadesh a woman with something worth a pruta, and that's very widely known general knowledge. But of course, it's also known not to be of great practical relevance, because I certainly hope that what one will eventually decide to use to be mekadesh one's wife with, I hope is going to be worth a great deal more than a pruta. It's interesting to know that there's no heter to steal something just because it's worth less than a pruta. The heter to take something is when it's worth when in context it's so small, it's really something that people don't mind about at all. A third issue is, okay, we spoke about the fence, which has a splinter, and the owner would never mind anyone taking that tiny splinter, that tiny that tiny bit of wood from his fence. But what about taking something which it's bigger than a splinter, but it happens to belong to your friend, and you know that your friend wouldn't mind you taking it because you have this close relationship with him. Now, he wouldn't want everyone to take it, but he certainly wouldn't mind you taking it. Does that then justify doing so? Do you say in the same way that something could be so small that the owner doesn't mind anyone taking it? In the same way, a person could have a relationship with a particular friend and he doesn't mind him or her, he doesn't mind that friend taking something of his. So here there's a famous machlokes about this point, because it's evident from a Tosfos Tosfos in Bava Metzia that we would say that if one were absolutely sure that one's relationship with the person was such that he wouldn't mind, one would be allowed to take that. But the Shach takes issue with that. A rare case where it's an Achron is famous for having argued with a Rishon. But the position of the Achron in this case is taken quite seriously. He wasn't that long after the period of the Rishonim, the Shach, but he was after them. Anyway, he says that this question is dependent on the general question known as Yush Shalei Midas, the famous machlokes Abaye and Rava, which again you may well be familiar with. The Gemara in the second parak of Bava Metzia talks about the concept of Yush, which we mentioned earlier. A person drops something a person has money in his pocket, and he's walking along, and suddenly he puts his hand in his pocket, realizes there's a hole in his pocket, realizes that the money that's in there has dropped, and he's been walking for a long while. He may look behind himself, but he doesn't see anything. So he knows the money is gone, and he has no hope of retrieving that. So he gives up on it. He abandons it. That's what we call Yush. And after Yush, the finder may keep it. But the problem is, what if the finder finds it before the Yush has occurred? That's known as the Shaila of Yush Shalei Midas, because they amplified one stage further. In this situation, the natural pathway, what we expect to happen is that after a few minutes, the person's going to check his pocket and find that he doesn't have the money, so he's going to abandon hope. So we know that is going to happen. But at the same time, we know, or we may suspect, that it hasn't yet happened. The Gemara describes that as Yush Shalei Midas, Yush without knowing about it. It's almost as if one could imagine a subconscious Yush without knowing about it. And that's a machlekes between Abaye and Rava. And Rava said that halachically it still qualifies as Yush. I guess his logic is if something's in such a situation, and that the Torah really allows you to take it. It's not the person's knowledge which makes a hefka. It's a situation which you're allowed to take something. And Abaya has a famous opinion that Yush Shalei Midas lo have a Yush. We need the actual Yush to permit the finder to keep the article. If he hasn't had the actual Yush, then lo have a Yush. The halacha of Yush doesn't set in. It doesn't yet apply. The Shach says the question of taking something from a friend of yours, where you know the friend of yours wouldn't mind if you asked him, but you're now doing so before you ask him, that's dependent on the side of Yush Shalei Midas, have a Yush and lo have a Yush. Just like we passed in the Yush Shalei Midas, lo have a Yush, it's going to actually be known about. So too, for a person to authorize you to use his property, he has to know that it's that you want to do so, in order that he can consciously give you that permission. That's the position of the Shach. And it remains the machlokes, and ideally one keeps to the opinion of the Shach. Although we acknowledge the cases as well, and then maybe people who are more lenient and would keep to that. I've always thought that there's an exception to that. This machlokes in the Shach, Tosfos and the Shach, and the conclusion that one ought to be machmir is in the particular case where one's only basis for wanting to take this item is the knowledge that the owner is a friend of mine, and therefore would want to give it to me. But there is a slightly different case, I believe. I haven't seen this explicitly discussed, where that machlokes between the Tosfos and the Shach is discussed, but I think it's pretty straightforward. If there are cases in which the person may not know that you want to borrow or have this particular item, but nevertheless he's done something to make it implicit that you ought to be able to have it. So for example, if a person invites you this evening to be a guest in his house, and you've come from a different town and you're staying there, you don't then need to say to him, "Oh, can I use the toilet paper to find an extreme example?" The fact that he's invited you in makes it implicit that he allows you to use certain things. And at that point, once one chaps that principle, one can use one's common sense to determine in which case one can say, ideally we don't accept the heter that I can use this because if he knew he would give me permission. But we do accept the idea, so as to say that my recent interaction with him has actively granted me permission to take this particular item or make use of that particular thing.
Isn't that almost implicit permission? You have the permission to do one thing, so implicit in that is that you would have permission to do other things that are sort of beneath that. So if you're invited, yeah, if you're given the permission to stay in somebody's house, then it's obvious you have the permission to use the bathroom, and so on. That it's not, you don't have to ask for individual permission for certain things. If you're given a more blanket permission to do something, that's implicit in giving you permission for other things.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's implicit permission rather than the assumption that he would give permission.
Right. But that's saying they're not
implicit and actual permission.
Yes, which is it's not assumed permission, because it is implicit. It's not
assumed or presumed. It's actual and implicit, but it's something that one may not immediately recognize to be actual and implicit. So I think it's worth pointing it out. And whilst the case of the guest is perhaps quite a clear-cut case, and one may feel it's an obvious case, once one has that concept, one can use it in other situations as well. The Gemara talks about kol mafkid al das ishto yivonov or mafkid. Gemara talks about a person. It's understood that a person borrows an article. Maybe it's talking about giving an article into someone else's safekeeping. It's understood if you give it to a person, a household owner, a balabais who has a wife and children, that his wife and children will sort of, for the purpose of this item, share his identity. There's implicit permission to members of a household, it would seem, to make use of one's own thing, and even to have a certain authorization to lend things or to give away things to a certain degree. And again, it's implicit in what we know about the relationship. So that's a third issue in Lo Sikzo. And the final and fourth issue is what I found very interesting. Let's suppose you own an office, or you run a shul building, and there are lots of people coming in and out, and there's an inevitable build-up of lost property over time. And a simple reading of the halachas of lost property would end up creating quite a stringent requirement to hold on to the property, to make announcements about the property in the hope that the owner will come forward, to do some double checks to make sure that he is the true owner, and so on. But one would have a responsibility to do that. And the problem that has often been, issues that have often been asked about and often arises, is that for some reason this lost property can add up, and it can become unmanageable, and you have a situation where very often things are not claimed, makes people feel it's rather futile, a waste of time and resources or space, messes up a room to keep piles of lost property. So anyway, one can avoid that under the circumstances. And many places have notices saying anything that one leaves in this property will be discarded after so and so much time. And some Rabbonim allow that, and they say, well, you make a condition, so you told people that's what's going to happen. I do acknowledge that a lot of people are giving that psak, and I suppose the basis for it is if they see it and they agree to it, then then they're accepting that. Personally, I find that a bit difficult because it seems almost as if one's putting up a notice saying, please be aware that we do not keep the halacha of Hasharos Aveda here. Just letting you know. Seems a bit odd that should work. What I've seen in one or two places, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has a short tshuva about this issue. I'm not sure whether he goes as far as this. But what I have seen written in some places, the notice saying, and something along these lines, usage of these premises, and it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about karka nigzelas. You're granted permission to come into here. Use of this property is granted on the understanding or accepting that every 3 months we discard any property that's left on here. But that, I think, would work better, because if you're saying something you're only allowed in under these circumstances, and the notice is prominent, and then he would notice, it then seems more reasonable to assume that the person reads that register and says, oh, okay, well, I do want to come in here, so I suppose I'm prepared to accept the condition. Once he accepts the condition, then he's willing to relinquish his ownership, or at least give permission, accept the fact that the gaboim of this place, the owners of this place, are going to act in this way. So there's 4 everyday issues of loy sigzol that we maybe tend not to be as aware of as we should be. Number 1, that there is loy sigzol on land, on karka. Number 2, there's no issue taking something that's so minor and so small that no one would mind. But there's a midas chasidus not to, and it's certainly wrong for many people to club together and ruin someone by making use of this loophole. The third thing we mentioned is something you know the owner, and therefore you know the owner wouldn't mind giving it to you. We mentioned the machlokes between Tosfos and the Shas. One should be machmir on the side of the shach, I think. And we explained the difference between that and the case of Yesh Shalei Midas. And that's it. That's a bit of inspiration about Lo Sigzol from the roots of creation, and a few things that come our way on a practical level.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Shkach.
Thank you.
Any further thoughts?
Just got one, but it's a bit late, so I don't know. Simon's points at the beginning got me thinking. Just very quickly, there's a book called The God Dilemma, written by the notorious and famous atheist Richard Dawkins, who's basically made it his life's mission to try to prove that we don't have God, or that we have no need for God. And actually, one of his points is that the moral framework in which we live today has almost, in many ways, completely converged with the moral framework mandated to us biblically. And therefore, since we've arrived at it, based on what works for society, which is what Simon was talking about at the beginning, what's the point of a biblical mandate if we're going to reach the same moral conclusions anyway, based on our own interactions with engagements with our fellow man? And that's why when we talk about why can't we steal gazela, the idea of theft, why should we find a reason for it? I prefer not to look for a reason. I prefer to say it's there, it's mandated, it's almost like a chok. Because if we start looking for moral grounds to justify things that are biblically ordained in very early chapters of Bereishis, then we're almost looking for justifications which we might say we could have come to the same conclusions anyway. That's the danger. That's the whole danger of this parallelism that Richard Dawkins talks about. That we've actually got there anyway as a society. I mean, he's wrong, And the reason he's fundamentally wrong is that we've only got to this point of morals because we're a Judeo-Christian. We've come from Judeo-Christian roots. That's why
the point of
we're
start. I mean, we're at this point from the probably from the divine revelation, aren't we?
Yeah. So we take these we define this framework not because it's natural, but because it comes from a Judeo-Christian framework. So I think it's just got to be, we've got to give we've got to place some distance between us and the ideas of Richard Dawkins, which I think are very, very dangerous. And anyway, but unfortunately, many millions of people read what he says.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Doniel,
Right,
one other thing before you go, on a personal thing, I wanted to tell you that we had a Chassan Bereishis